Oh my God, I feel like a rock star. Right. Welcome to this session. The conference is nearly over, but this is the month that Jeremy Hunt became the longest-serving Secretary of State for Health. So we're going to ask, what is the job really like? What advice does he need? Does he need any advice? And how has the job changed over time? And it is my absolute pleasure to ask me to join on stage Stephen Dorrell, who was the Health Secretary from 1995 to 97, who is now, as you know, Chair of the NHS Confederation. Frank Dobson, who was Health Secretary from 97 to 99. And last but not least, Norman Lamb, Minister of State for Care and Support from 2012 to 2015. And I was just saying to them, it was like seeing my life flash before my eyes. I worked with every single one of them. Okay, I'm going to ask you, we have very little time, sadly, because this session could go on for a long time, but I want to start, first of all, with you, Stephen. Okay, give me one piece of advice for Jeremy Hunt.
One piece of advice: stay close to the Prime Minister. The key job of the Secretary of State for Health is to ensure that he or she wins their arguments with the Treasury. I stayed close to it. It was easier for me. I got on with my Prime Minister.
Why are you pointing at Frank?
We'll come on to that.
So did I at the time.
What, his Prime Minister?
It was settled. I remember it very well. Key argument, I was at a dinner with the ABPI, and my mind was not on the audience in front of me, because I had to go from there to the Prime Minister's flat to settle the discussion at about 1 o'clock in the morning. It's what's called rational decision-making.
And you made it there by 1 o'clock in the morning?
I made it there by about 10, and it took till 1.
Oh, goodness. Frank, what would you say to that?
Well, I endorse that as an approach. But quite frankly, I think what he needs to do is to work out what the National Health Service actually needs, partly to make up for the years of neglect that are just coming to an end, partly to enable the hard-working people in the health service to do their day jobs, and partly to fund transformation. And any talk of 4% bringing that about is just crackers. It may be what the Treasury wants to hear, but it's not going to transform the health service. So he needs to find out what's needed and demand it. And even if he doesn't get it, at least he's asked.
I want to ask you, Norman, I mean, you worked with him.
I did.
You were there. Did you feel like he had the air of the Prime Minister at the time? Did you think that he knew how critical that relationship was between the Department of Health and Number 10?
Well, there were quite significant battles between the Department of Health and particularly the Treasury. And there was one moment during the coalition when a letter came from the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, which in effect sought to take over day-to-day control of the finances of the department from Jeremy Hunt. And it got quite a robust response. And this never appeared in the public domain.
No, I'll say.
But it was the most extraordinary letter written by Danny Alexander and George Osborne, and deeply critical of the stewardship, the financial stewardship of the department. As I say, it had a robust response. But the point of advice I was going to give was to recognise the strength of your position now, because he's been a survivor. He's still there, longest serving, as you say. And he's in a very powerful position if he chooses to use that power to get the deal that the NHS needs. And indeed also not only on the finances, but the transformation that, as Frank describes, that needs to happen, particularly between health and social care.
Was it a job that you loved doing, or were you pleased? Did you breathe a sigh of relief when you left?
When the government of which I was a member was defeated.
I was trying to
No, is the answer to that.
There must have been a point when you thought that it's such a complex departments. And there are always, you know, swirling around the rumours that you get sent there as a punishment sometimes, you know, because it's hard to stay there for long.
I think there's a serious answer to that, and I actually think that it is one of the best jobs in the government because it's a unique opportunity to be responsible for one of the key elements of social policy. When as a member of parliament, you leave the department and you go back to your constituency and you ask your constituents what they care about of what goes on in Westminster, the National Health Service is always very close to the top of their order of priorities. So to be the person responsible for social policy and for delivering the best you can from the organisations in the National Health Service is a huge privilege. I think it's one of the best jobs anyone could be asked to do.
I don't know which it might have been one of you two, but I remember the story that a former Secretary of State for Health said that it's like being in a signal box, a signalman, and you're pulling the levers in your office, and then you suddenly realise that the levers aren't connected to anything. That things that you do in Whitehall have absolutely no impact unless you really focus on implementation.
That was Ken Clark, actually.
Yeah, was it? But that's very true.
Yeah. Well, it's partly true, but some of the levers do work. Setting up NICE worked to help the patients and the National Health Service. Setting up NHS Direct worked. It wouldn't have worked if I'd taken civil service advice on how to go about it, I have to say.
Well, you and I have talked often about what you did in the testing for VCJD, and which I know that you're particularly proud of it.
Well, yes, we don't have time to describe my initiation in what to do about CJD and can it be transmitted through blood. But there was a meeting which I called as soon as I heard the possibility of being transmitted through blood. And there were 4 different opinions. One was it couldn't be transmitted through blood. One was it could be but unlikely. Another was, well, maybe. And another was, damn sure it can. And I have to say, I concluded damn sure it can sounded the soundest advice. And the civil servants, rather than the scientists, said, well, why don't we put it to some of the scientific advisory committees? And I thought, well, if it's true, people will die while they are conducting their committee deliberations. And so I authorised the leukodepletion of the blood supply at a cost of £100 million, which is a lot of money. And I went to Downing Street, and certainly while I was Health Secretary, I got on very, very well with Tony Blair. And we were chatting about this, that and the other, and I said, oh, by the way, I've authorised spending £100 million on a project in the hope that it turns out to be a waste of money, to which he gave this Prime Ministerial reply, fuck me. But again, I have to say, to his credit, although the Treasury didn't like it and all sorts of people didn't like it, he gave me absolute 100% full backing on that decision. And in 2015, it was finally acknowledged, and there was a report saying that it worked. This prescient decision, as it was described, was taken against the balance of scientific advice. So I thought that was quite worthwhile, really.
There was a lot of that language when Frank was in, I remember.
Yes. Could you tell us how good Tony Blair's relationships with Frank were when he was in the department?
Yeah, it seemed to go very smoothly.
Very diplomatic.
Yes. I think I know the answer to this, but when you left, what were you most proud of? What legacy when you left?
I think it was to advance the cause of support for people with mental ill health and to introduce the first ever maximum waiting time standards in mental health, particularly for early intervention in psychosis. And what I saw in the department, every Monday morning there was the great and the good of the NHS sitting around the Secretary of State's table. And there was this extraordinary micromanagement of data for every hospital in the country, their performance against the 4-hour A&E standard, the cancer standards, the 18-week standard, and nothing on mental health. And the combination of those very politically resonant standards, together with the financial incentives for activity, just dictated where the money went, and mental health always lost out. And so to introduce some sort of equilibrium of rights of access to treatment seemed to be critically important. So I think that's one of the things that I was particularly proud of. I was also proud of taking the Care Act through Parliament and legislating to introduce DILNOT. And of course the tragedy is that since then that was abandoned after we legislated for it.
Stephen, I just looked down at my briefing notes and it said, ask them about the World Cup. I thought, oh my God, why? But actually, I read the second part of the sentence, which actually is interesting. Is there too much political football in the NHS, and what can be done to bridge the divide? There's a very spurious link. And let me tell you, I have thought up some of my own questions. But this one I was intrigued by, because there have been discussions over having more of a coalition, more of a united front on how to run the NHS. Where do you stand on that?
I will answer the question, but when you mentioned the World Cup, I thought you were going to remind me of the fact that John Major made me briefly Minister of Sport. And since sport has always been something that has completely passed me by, I learnt a lot. Now, I'm not sure I contributed very much to the development of British sport.
Yes, I sympathise.
But more seriously, I think there's two issues here, and as you know, the Confederation has sought to address this through the IFS report we published in conjunction with the IFS and Health Foundation earlier this month, that we can never take the health service out of politics, and I don't think it's a legitimate ambition. As I've already said, voters care about what goes on in the NHS, and it will always be political. But that doesn't mean that we should excuse low-grade political debate, what passes sometimes for debate. And it's why the Confederation came together with IFS and the Health Foundation to try to put some facts into the debate about resources so that we can have a more mature debate over a longer term about how we deliver the ambition we're very good at describing.
You have, Frank, you now have the advantage of being able to have a look at a number of years since you were doing it. And from your observations, do you think that the job has changed? Do you think that health secretaries have different pressures on them, or?
No, I think it's broadly speaking the same. They may think they've got different pressures on them, but I don't think they have. But returning to the World Cup, well,
oh my God.
let's say football, let's say the Premier League. I hope the government have noticed that the people at the top of the Premier League have all the money that they need, and the sides that get relegated don't have all the money that they need, and they should make sure that the NHS is at the top there with the money that it needs. The other thing is, I'm in favour of a consensus as long as it's the right consensus. The biggest problem has been in recent times, there's been this mad management consultant consensus, which is the fewer hospital beds there are and the more patients treated, the more efficient the National Health Service can be. And now it's not just during the winter, it's during the summer that there aren't enough beds. And do you know, it may be because we don't have enough beds. I know this is a mad idea, but there we are. But the next thing is there's been a consensus about fragmenting the parts of the National Health Service and giving them very separate budgets, which doesn't help cooperation. And if you separate all the hospitals out into foundation trusts and they start buying scalpels and rubber gloves themselves instead of the NHS or the whole of the north of England buying them, then they'll cost more because it won't be the bulk purchases. And the other thing is, of course, the competition. The competition is irreconcilable with the transformation that the National Health Service needs. And I think that that's one of the things that the new NHS boss, I can never remember anybody's titles anymore, Simon Stevens, who did, after all, used to work for me. I think he's working for the NHS, I have to say, and he's recognised that competition isn't the way forward, and that there's got to be cooperation. And if there's going to be cooperation, you can't have separate budgets, because people won't, economise to let another lot's budget boom. It's got to be all brought together. And if we could get rid of the old consensus, that's fine, and we need to establish a new consensus, which is working together and having enough money to do it properly.
Well, I absolutely believe we need to build a political consensus for a new settlement, and critically for the NHS and for social care. And the danger is we'll have an announcement, next Sunday or whenever it is, about extra money for the NHS, and nothing said about social care. And we'll have to wait to the autumn for that. Well, what will the deal then be for social care? Because unless you invest in the preventive services that stop people ending up unnecessarily in hospital, we'll still keep getting it wrong. And the awful truth is that whether you're talking about a Labour government, a Conservative government, or a coalition government, no governments want to increase tax, and they don't do it because they fear other political parties will attack them. And so you get this awful inertia, and we've got to work together to crack that and to recognise the need to increase taxation.
Well, we know that Jeremy Hunt is standing in the wings listening to all this wonderful advice and taking it on board, I know, absolutely. Can I just thank my wonderful panel? That was a very easy session for me to have to chair. And can I now ask Neil Dickson, Chief Executive, as you know, of the NHS Confederation, to come on stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well done. Very good. Excellent. Thank you. Now, our final speaker, obviously, well, he's just had an introduction. I was going to give one, but there is no need now. I think that was a perfect introduction in many ways. He's the longest serving health secretary, as we've already heard, since the post was created. Survived, I think it's 5 cabinet reshuffles, which is pretty something, longest serving cabinet minister, and he's still smiling. He joins us amidst what can only be called interesting times. Without further ado, please welcome the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, the Right Honourable Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Well, thank you very much indeed, Neil. I mean, that was a really perfect introduction, wasn't it? To have 3 of my predecessors all saying exactly what I need to do right now. And I've never quite had that before, but it was a fascinating discussion. And I want to start by thanking all of you for putting up with me for longer than you have put up with any other health secretary before. It has been an extraordinary journey for me, and I have come to appreciate that in frontline politics there are a huge amount of elephant traps that you have to navigate. I remember a few years back going into hospital to have a BCC removed from my head, and the local anaesthetic had been administered. I was on the operating table, the surgeon had his scalpel out, and the nurse looked at me and said, "By the way, Mr. Hunt, what is it you do for a living?" And I froze for a moment, and I'm afraid I ducked it. I said, "I'm a member of Parliament." But I also remember when my 3rd child was born back in 2014, and we went into the maternity unit at Chelsea in Westminster, and it was just a week after the midwives had voted to strike for the first time in 100 years. And it wasn't the icy looks from the midwives, of which there were actually very few. It was the icy looks from my wife saying the timing was just atrocious for this. And then you know, obviously I have a lot of making up to do to my wife because it's a massive pressure on anyone's family. So I do remember taking her away to Amsterdam for the weekend, just the two of us. And we were sitting in a cafe. Wasn't one of those cafes, in case you were wondering. We overheard some English tourists on the next table saying, "Yes, I've just Googled her. It really is his wife." So, but what I have never forgotten are the first words that I said when I got the job, which is that it is the biggest privilege of my life. But what I now realize is that anyone here today could have said exactly those same words, because working in healthcare, working with people in the most vulnerable moments of their life, when they're sick and when they're dying, is an extraordinary privilege. And I think that is one of the most incredible things about the NHS, which is the dedication, the commitment, the passion that people show day in, day out in response to that privilege. And as Confed, you are the leaders of NHS organisations, and there is a very, very special and hard responsibility that falls on your shoulders. And I want to thank all of you for the way you bear that responsibility, and through you I want to thank the doctors, nurses, physios, AHPs, cleaners, caterers, managers, everyone who works in your organisation for the extraordinary contribution that they make to our national life, and how much it really does mean not just to NHS patients, but also to the country as a whole. And I also want to congratulate you, because I think when the history of this period is written, people will say it was a period where some really important progress was made despite extreme pressure. A few months back, Bill Clinton came to London, and he said some very interesting things over his lifetime. He once said that politics is like working in a graveyard. There are lots of people underneath you, but they're not necessarily listening. I think that's something that many of the people who were on the panel before with Victoria could have identified with. But this time he said something really interesting. He said, in politics, we always look at the headlines, but we should also take time to look at the trend lines. And the specific example of this that is often quoted is the fact that we read in the papers a lot about famine, about people making perilous boat journeys across the Mediterranean, about inequality, about poverty. But actually, when I was born in 1966, half the world's population were in absolute poverty. Now it's just 9%. In fact, every single day for the last 25 years, 137,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. And that's the trend line, which is so different to the headline. And in the NHS, you could say exactly the same thing. If you look at the headlines, for example, on cancer, you will see that we're missing some of our cancer targets at the moment, and Callie Palmer has a very good plan in place to put that right, and we want to put that right. But the trend line, as opposed to the headline, is actually that there are 7,000 people alive today who wouldn't be alive if we'd stuck with the cancer survival rates that we had in 2010. The trend line is that we've all understood for a long time that the key with cancer is early detection. And in order to get that right, this year we will treat over 60,000 more people for cancer than we were treating 5 or so years ago. That means that every single day, 170 more people are starting treatment for cancer. So the trend line is actually that our cancer survival rates are at record levels. And you could say the same in cardiac care, where the headline would be that not all our ambulance services are hitting their 8-minute target for heart attacks, although they're doing a lot better recently. That's the headline, but the trend line is that if you look at our survival rates in the last year that we measured, the survival rates for heart disease the mortality rates have gone down from 9.6% to 8.9%. That means at the end of that year, 2016, there are 500 people alive who wouldn't have been alive if we'd stuck with the survival rates at the start of that year. That means an extra life being saved every day just as a result of the improvements over 1 year. And you could say the same for stroke, where the headlines are the big public controversies over the reorganisation of stroke services, and people's worry that they're going to have to go further to a hyperacute stroke unit. The trend line is that over 6 years, we had one of the fastest improvements across the whole OECD in our stroke survival rates, and it's still getting better. Mental health, another one which Norman Lamb and I worked very closely on together. We read the headlines with great concern about the time it takes for young people to access mental health services, and that's why we published the Green Paper. But actually behind that, the trend line is that we've had one of the biggest expansions in Europe for anxiety and depression services, 1,500 more people being treated every day. The model that we've set up with IAPT is actually being copied in Stockholm and admired all over the world. And finally, I want to mention A&E, because that really does grab a lot of headlines. And today we have our latest monthly figures out, which show that we are back above 90%, but we're not yet hitting 95%. But under that headline, what's the trend there? The trend is compared to May last year, 12 months earlier, in our A&Es, we are treating 3,200 more people every single day within the 4-hour standard. So we have been making superhuman efforts to keep the public safe. And I want to use this moment to thank all of you for the huge, huge effort that you and your organisations made this winter. I think we did more extensive preparations than we've ever done. Big additional capacity in the social care system, which led to a big reduction in detox. The GP streaming service, which is now virtually universal across the NHS, 1 million more people getting the flu jab, which of course turned out to be extremely important. But then GP services open over Christmas. Nearly 40% of 111 calls ended up being handled by a clinician. That diverted huge numbers of people from A&E, and of course the new ambulance response programme. All of these made a massive impact in helping us to cope with the most difficult winter that we've had for a very, very long time. And that's why all of us need to give all our support to Pauline Phillip, Ian Dalton and Simon Stevens in our plans for this winter, where, as you know, our big focus is going to be on the 3-week stays, which we know is about 22% of all hospital bed days. And if we can reduce those by 25% across the system, that will release 4,000 beds, which will give us a huge and absolutely critical amount of extra capacity across that very, very challenging winter period. So trend lines are important, as well as the headlines. And one of the things I've learned, and actually it came across from the session that preceded us, is that nothing happens to health secretaries for the first time. The first person to have a contract turned down that asked for more weekend working in exchange for more pay was actually not me, but Alan Milburn, I think back in 2002. And so sometimes you reflect on what you've learned and what you wish you'd learned over the years. And I suppose there are 3 things that I really, on reflection, think that I've had to go on a big journey on in terms of my own learning. And let me tell you what these 3 are. The first is the critical importance of workforce planning. The first major crisis that I had to deal with was mid-staffs. If you read that Francis report, it's totally clear that we had short-staffed wards and we needed urgently to get more nurses into our wards, and we took a huge amount of measures. All of you were part of those measures, introducing ward transparency of nurse numbers, duty of candour, the new CQC inspection regime. We did a huge amount. never once in that process did we ask ourselves where the extra nurses were going to come from. And in fact, we do have around 15,000 more nurses in the NHS now than we had then. But because that wasn't planned strategically, we also ended up putting £1 billion onto the agency bill. Now, we've made big progress in cutting that down. But what I'm really proud about is that we've made even bigger progress in making sure that every new plan that we have in the NHS has a proper workforce plan going alongside it. So the mental health forward view will need an extra 19,000 posts to be filled. The CAMS Green Paper will need an extra 8,000 posts. We know that we're going to need to increase the number of midwives we train by 25% for our maternity transformation programme. And most importantly of all, we have for the first time got a 10-year workforce plan, which we published the draft. And this is our big opportunity, because what is different, profoundly different from when Frank was Health Secretary, when Stephen was Health Secretary, is that we know that in 10 years' time we're going to be having 1 million more over 75s to look after. That is coming down to hit us like a train coming down the track. And we can look at that and we can say we're going to plan strategically, work out exactly how many doctors we need, how many nurses, how many midwives, how many AHPs, plan for that strategically. Or we can put our head in the sands and do it on a hand-to-mouth basis. And whatever your views on the Brexit debate, I believe that we drew false comfort from the idea that if we didn't train enough at home, we'd always be able to import people. Now, people from overseas do a fantastic job, and the NHS would fall over without their help. But the truth is we're not the only country with an ageing population. Spain and Portugal need their nurses. China's recruiting 180,000 obstetricians because of their change to the one-child policy. India wants 4 million more doctors and nurses. There is a huge upscaling of capacity in global health systems. The World Health Organization says there's a 2.6 million shortage of doctors across the world, a 9 million shortage of nurses. And if we are going to address those issues, we have to be training on a sustainable basis. But once we do that, and that's why I am so proud that we have now got 25% increases in both doctor training places, nurse training places, and midwife training places. Once we do that, we are then able to make the argument that in the period between now and when those training places convert into fully trained clinicians, the government should be flexible on visas. And that is why it is extremely welcome that today the Prime Minister has announced that doctors and nurses will be removed from the Tier 2 visa caps, which means that the NHS will be able to recruit the number of doctors and nurses that we need from overseas. So workforce planning is the first thing that I really think we need to get right going forward. The second is the critical interrelationship between the health system and other systems like the social care system. And Norman was talking about this earlier. I would say this. In 2010, in the face of the worst financial crisis that we had since the Second World War, the government had to take some incredibly difficult decisions to put the economy back on its feet. And thank goodness we have created 3 million jobs since then, because that has meant that we are in a position to talk about a new funding settlement for both the NHS and the social care system. But when you look at the correlation between the reduction in the capacity of domiciliary care and the increase in the same kind of patients going to A&Es, you also have to acknowledge that the cuts in the social care system had a profound impact on the NHS. And what that means is that going forward, we must make sure that as we put together a long-term plan for the NHS, so we also need a long-term plan for the social care system to go hand in glove. They may not be launched or announced at the same time, but they are both equally important and equally essential. And why is that? Because for both of them, we need to work together on prevention. The social care system needs more domiciliary care in order to stop people graduating into needing full-time residential care. We need more support in the community to stop people going to hospitals. And so it is a complete joint endeavour, and that means a transformation in community care as we move the centre of gravity from cure to prevention and cure. And that, I think, is a huge opportunity that we face now. And then the final thing which I've really learnt over the last 5.5 years is the role of culture in driving change in any large organisation. I've really shied away from discussions about getting culture right when I started as Health Secretary because it's such a nebulous thing, and it felt to me like it was unlikely that I was going to be able to make any tangible change. But when we dealt with those problems at Midstaffs, we put in place a huge number of measures to practically improve the quality and safety of care. And they have really borne fruit. We now know that 2.1 million more people are being treated in good or outstanding hospitals every year than 5 years ago. 4.7 million more people in good or outstanding GP surgeries. But there's so much more to do. We know, according to the Hogan-Darzian Black analysis, we still have around 150 preventable deaths every single week. We still have huge numbers of never events in our hospitals. And even though the Commonwealth Fund rate us as the safest healthcare system in the world, we know there is unsafe care all around us in the NHS. And if we're going to get that right, we have to get the culture right. And that means moving from a blame culture to a learning culture, turning our NHS, the 5th largest organisation in the world, into the world's largest learning organisation. And that's why this week we announced another package of safety measures, extending the Learning from Deaths programme to primary care for the first time, which will be very important. The launch of the National Clinical Information Programme, chaired by Norman Williams, which will share information on clinical outcomes amongst more than 70% of consultants over 30 specialties, the most ambitious programme of its kind in the world. The introduction of medical examiners from next year, which will mean that every death will be looked at by a second independent opinion, and our response to the widespread concerns over the Bawa-Garba case, whilst not in any way challenging what the court chose to say about Bawa-Garba, we must make sure that we continue on this journey from a blame culture to a learning culture. So I think lots of you will be wanting me to tell you how my discussions are going with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and I would love to be able to share that with you. But sadly, I'm just going to have to limit myself to saying that discussions are difficult, they are ongoing, but we should never doubt this Prime Minister's commitment to our NHS, to the people who work in it, and to the patients who depend on it. And if we are successful in creating a climate where we can put together a proper 10-year plan for the NHS, I hope we do 3 things. First of all, I hope we avoid the mistakes of the past. We don't do famine very well in the NHS, but we also don't do feast very well. If we create a stable, long-term funding environment, then let's do those things that are going to really transform our system for decades to come. The truth is, no healthcare system anywhere in the world is going to have enough money in the next few decades. So let's focus on productivity, on efficiency, on the elimination of waste to free up as much resource as possible for frontline care. And I think the biggest single thing I'd like to see is the transformation of our hospital IT systems, which are often pretty lousy and can do a huge amount to unleash the time of doctors and nurses on the front line. But also let's use this as a moment, as Frank said, to make sure we really do get that transformation happening, that change in our care pathways, so that we move properly to prevention rather than cure. So that's a very important opportunity for us to get right as we go forward. Then we need to think about some other opportunities that we need to get right. And I think one of them is to make sure that we unite the NHS and the British people with a small set of bold ambitions as to how we want to transform our system, to get our cancer survival rates up to the best in Europe, to transform our maternity safety so that it's as good as Sweden, to truly integrate health and social care so that our frail older people are getting that care wrapped around them in the way they need, to make sure that we have waiting time standards for mental health that are as strong and powerful as the waiting time standards that we have for physical health. Let's put together some simple goals, not too many, that we all recognise and appreciate, run through the heart of what we're trying to change. And if we do that, if you give the NHS simple, clear goals, we will deliver those goals. But we'll also be saying something to the British people. We'll be saying, no, we do not accept that the NHS is condemned to inevitable decline. No, we do not accept that this is the time to rein back our dreams for the NHS. And yes, we are committed to the NHS being the safest, highest quality, most patient-focused system in the world. And that really matters, because 70 years ago, when we set up the NHS, we were saying something profoundly important, not just about the practicalities of how we want healthcare to be delivered, but about our values as a nation. We were saying that in this country, everyone matters. It doesn't matter who you are, rich, poor, young, old, city, countryside, everyone matters. And we were just the 6th country in the world to set up a universal health system. But we have come to be emblematic of what universal healthcare is. So as we restate our vows to the British people 70 years on, we are saying exactly the same thing. Everyone matters. It matters if you are someone with a mental health problem as much as a physical health problem. It matters if you're a baby, because we're going to take that extra trouble to make sure that you don't end up with a lifelong disability. It matters if you're a teenager wanting to get access to mental health services. It matters if you're an older person who needs care wrapped around you. Every single person matters. And that central link between what we do and the values we stand for is why the NHS has always been, to the people of this country, something that is part of the definition of being British. So I have to be careful not to get carried away, because otherwise I'll want to be Health Secretary for another 5 years, and that would, I know, be a complete disaster for everyone in this room. But let me just say this. If we turned heads around the world 70 years ago, we can do it again today. So let's go for it. Let's be bold, and let's deliver that promise. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Jerry. I'm conscious of we haven't got a huge amount of time. I want to give you as much time as possible. A plea, could you make your question really short, and so preferably no speeches? I make a plea to Jeremy for relatively short answers, and there'll be people coming around. Put your hand up and there'll be paddles will arrive. Let me just ask you an introductory question, just picking on one point that you said, which you talked about a health and care settlement, both of those. We hear a lot about an NHS settlement. Funnily enough, there is quite a lot of anxiety within the health system about social care. I mean, it's been one of the big changes, I think, over the last few years. So you, in your mind, with your new joint title, you do see the need for, and I know it's complicated with local government and the rest, you do see the need for these things to be, in a sense, seen together.
They absolutely have to be seen together. We are part of the same system, and even if the timings for sorting out these problems are not identical, we have a huge amount of work that's going on now for a new green paper for social care, and we have to proceed with that work and make sure we get it absolutely right. But the destination must be a long-term plan for the health system and the social care system that are completely joined up, two sides of the same coin.
Okay, and the question I asked Simon yesterday, just to be clear about, I suppose there's some anxiety, and I think there's genuine excitement and commitment within the service, but also a slight worry that the centre, in whatever its shape or form, will dream this thing up. And I know Simon's talked about setting up an assembly and so forth. Are you very committed to the idea that the members of the Confed, the NHS as a whole, and indeed the social care system will, in a sense, genuinely co-create this plan rather than, I mean, there may be things that, as a government, you quite rightly say, well, we're, on behalf of the people who are paying for this, these are things we expect. But could we have a process which is more involving than we've seen in the past?
Well, I think the 5-year forward view was a very good model because there was a lot of consultation about that before it was published. I think there's really a two-stage process. There's the part of the process where the government analyses what it thinks the NHS needs and what it thinks the country can afford. But then I think there's a second stage where the NHS goes away and works out in a great deal of detail what can be delivered. But one thing that people like David Nicholson often say is that there is, I think, a role for politicians who ultimately are the people responsible to the electorate in setting ambitions and making sure that we have some big, bold ambitions. The last Labour government had very big ambitions to bring down waiting times, and they were largely successful. And I think that not everything was successful about that period, but I think that is one of the things that improved in the noughties. And I think if we're going to have another 10-year plan, this is time to have some bold, simple ambitions, and they do need political leadership behind them.
Okay, thank you. Right, number one, please.
Just state, Paul Jenkins from the Tavistock and Portman and chair of the Mental Health Network. I want to connect two of your themes. Yesterday we had a session here about mental health at work and the mental health of the NHS workforce. Can one of our ambitions for the next 10 years to be for the NHS to be a real leader in looking after the mental health and well-being of its staff, recognising the contribution that's going to make to recruitment and retention, but also crucially recognising the contribution that engaged staff with good well-being mean in terms of good quality patient care and productivity?
Well, I can see you've got a lot of support, and I'm happy to support you as well, because I think it's something we should set a good example on. Employers in this country, we are one of the few countries in the world where employers don't make a contribution to health costs. In France, Germany, America, you set up a business, you will be paying a lot on top of the wage bill for health costs. So I do think that employers need to recognise it's in their own interests to be progressive and far-sighted about their employees' care. And in the NHS, if we look at the two big areas that cause staff sickness and staff absence, which are mental health and MSK, I think we are ideally positioned to take a lead, and we are currently thinking through what we might be able to say in that area, but I think it's an area we could be very ambitious, yes.
Okay, thank you. Number 4.
Good afternoon, Jeremy. It's David Pearson here from STP lead, ICS lead for Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, and also a trustee of the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services. So I'm very pleased that the health service is likely to get immediate announcements of investment as someone who's leading a health and social care system. However, the ADAS budget survey this week shone a light on the very precarious nature of the social care market, the very unstable nature of the workforce with a 27.8% turnover each year, and the worry from directors that in order to make next year's cuts, we will have to reduce the number of people served. Given that, and given the fact that the Ipsos Mori report said that 82% of people in the surveyed support the appropriate settlement for adult social care, with 77% supporting NHS, first time I think that must have happened in history. Do you think that, do you feel confident that the uncertainty of the last 20 years of 13 green and white papers and commissions will get resolved by you and your colleagues? What confidence do you have? Because I think the sector may well feel very nervous about an announcement about the NHS which doesn't take account of social care.
Well, I think, I completely understand those concerns. I would just point out that we have a Prime Minister who's talked about social care more than any of her predecessors ever have. She prioritised social care in the budget last year. Generally, Prime Ministers are able to make one big ask of the Treasury in a budget. Her ask was social care. Extra £1 billion went into social care in last year's budget. She prioritised social care policy reform in the manifesto at the last election, not entirely successfully, it has to be said, but it was a sign of her commitment to this as an area that needs reform. And she's changed the name of my department and my job title to make absolutely sure that me or whoever is in that role understands the critical importance of social care. So I think that message is very, very well understood. We need, with this ageing population, a sustained increase in capacity across both health and social care. And they both have to be partners, and we're totally interdependent. So, as I say, I can't make any commitments about the timing, but I am absolutely certain the government does understand that a long-term plan for social care is as important as a long-term plan for health.
Number 2, please.
Hi, Kevin James. I'm from Co-Production Norfolk, which is a user-led initiative that works in co-production with those who design and deliver services. Just thinking about severe mental illness and physical health, and that people with severe mental illness can and will die between 12 and 25 years younger than their contemporaries because of the medications that they take. There seems to be a real disconnect between primary care and secondary services when it comes to ownership of who's responsible for looking after that person's physical health. What can you do to encourage primary care to work much closer with secondary services around making sure people don't die younger than others because they have a severe mental illness and they use antipsychotic medication?
It's a very important thing that we are absolutely not getting right. And I think the issue is, I'm glad you talked about the integration of primary and secondary care, because we often talk about the integration of health and social care, but actually inside the NHS, the integration of mental health and physical health services in primary and secondary care is very, very important. And what we are looking at is how we completely change the way our care pathways work at the moment, so that when you go in for mental health treatment as part of your treatment, your physical health needs are able to be addressed. But likewise, when you go in for physical health treatment, there's often a mental health issue that can be sitting behind it. And what we really need is for the doctor in front of you to take responsibility for the whole package. I know it's what doctors would like to do, but our system has still got too many silos that makes that difficult, and means that people end up being pushed from one part of the system to the other, and it can be immensely frustrating. So that is absolutely an area that we need to do better on.
And can I just ask that point? I mean, again, I think we've seen both in the exhibition and throughout the conference, there is huge amounts of innovation going on. There's a lot of stuff happening within the community and so forth. But I think there's also a sense of, in the next 10 years, some of this has got to be industrialized. So we've got lots of projects and great ideas going on here, there, and everywhere. But it's almost as if we are going to have any effect on the demand, a really significant effect on the demand curve, and we cannot cope, we simply will not. Even with your extra money, will not. The system will still boil over unless we can change the way in which we deliver. Have we got the right tools and incentives and whatever else it is in place in order to get that real shift? We've seen a reduction in the amount spent on primary care over the last period. We've got a 72% increase in hospital doctors. Everybody's acknowledging that the acute sector is very unlikely to shrink, but we definitely need to get investment into new models of care.
We do. And I think that's one of the lessons of the last 5 years, is that we found that when we have pressures in the acute sector, they tend to suck in resources that then denudes transformation funding and transformation plans. So if we get a sustainable long-term settlement, we need to find a way of making sure that transformation funding is protected and that we really do have a structured program to increase the capacity of primary care. I think that's the only way that we're going to deal with this issue in the long run.
Thank you. 3, please.
Hi, I'm Katie Lees. I'm a graduate management trainee, and that's kind of what I want to ask a question about, really. I know there is plans to expand the graduate scheme, and we talk a lot about clinical staff and the need to improve that, but we do need more leaders in the NHS as well. But I'm not sure about how the expansion is going to be managed, and I know this is quite a specific question, but I guess you can expand it to more leaders. But how are you going to ensure that the quality of leaders is kept to such a high standard that it is at the moment, and what are the plans for using the graduate scheme to do that?
Well, I think running an NHS organisation is one of the most difficult and challenging jobs in Britain today. So I salute you for going into the NHS because we need bright, smart young people to choose NHS management as a career of choice. I think it is also one of the most rewarding things that you can possibly do. But we need to dramatically increase the size of the pipeline of people going into those roles. And I think one of the things to do that we need to do is to break down the barriers that stop clinicians wanting to move into management roles. At the moment, they look at management sometimes with a sort of traditional view that it's the dark side, sometimes with concern that they won't be able to keep up the clinical practice, and sometimes, frankly, because they're worried that managers seem to have very high turnover, and they're worried that the time they'll get to turn things around won't be long enough. So I think we need a lot more stability, a much more structured talent management programme. And the new chair of NHS Improvement, Dido Harding, is focusing on that herself. And that is definitely something we need to get right.
Now, I'm just going to say, end the session in a moment, but before I do, I just want to say we're running slightly late. The next session involves staff from each of the generations of the NHS, and if you are able, I'm just conscious that we don't have a mass exodus. If the more of you can stay, it would be great. It will not be a very long session, and then we will have tea and cake thereafter in the exhibition area, in the in-conversation zone, where we'll actually have somebody who was actually working on the day the NHS began. But that would be great. I want to end by thanking you, Jeremy, very much, both for, as ever, a bravura performance and a really reflective look back and more importantly, from all our points of view, a look forward. And I think there is a sense of anticipation at the moment, but there is also a genuine, there's much greater shared understanding, I think, across the system than I've ever seen, certainly for many, many years, about what the challenges that we face, and also recognition that our individual parts are very unlikely to solve this. So as a GP, you can't solve it. Even somebody in mental health can't solve it. The answer is we are all utterly and much more than we used to recognise dependent on each other, and I think that was very much captured by your remarks. So can I ask you to thank, in the usual way, the Secretary of State.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Deputy Chief Executive of NHS Confederation, Danny Mortimer.
Sorry, mass exodus. No, it's okay.
I always have this effect on rooms. Thank you so much for those of you that are staying with us. This final session of the day, as Niall rightly said, celebrates the key ingredient in the success of the 70-year history of the NHS. It's people. People who have been drawn from all backgrounds and parts of the world to work in the NHS. We were honoured the night before Confed started to play host to colleagues who celebrated the contribution of the Windrush generation to the NHS. And I'm particularly proud to welcome to the stage 10 men and women who've dedicated their lives to service in the NHS. All of the people who are about to come onto the stage with me are active members of the NHS Retirement Fellowship. And for those of you who are staying for the next 15 minutes for us, and for those of you who are slipping out the door to catch your trains, I'd ask you to go back to your organisations and to check what contribution you're making to the work of the NHS Retirement Fellowship. I'm proud to be a trustee of the fellowship. I'm proud to work with John and his colleagues. I think it's really important as organisations that we maintain a contact with our past and maintain a contact with those people who've gone before us in terms of caring for our patients and caring for our community. So let me leave that thought with you. Go back and find out, what is it you do? How do you let people who are retiring from your organisations find out about the work of the NHS Retirement Fellowship? Do you make facilities available? Do you help them contribute to your newsletters and your bulletins and your communications? Please do that. That bond that's created between active retirement fellowships and the present and the future of the NHS is a really important and powerful one. And I'm really delighted to welcome colleagues to the stage. We've got... Peter, could I talk to you first? You, I know, followed in your father's footsteps in a career in medicine, qualified in surgery, even better. And you qualified in the 60s. What was it like being a junior doctor when you first embarked upon that in the NHS?
I suspect rather different than it is today. The things that one remembers, particularly the hours that we worked, and the camaraderie that developed whilst we were all living as residents in the hospital. The hours were frankly atrocious. As a house officer at Manchester Royal Infirmary, which is just down the road, 2 house officers were allocated to each clinical unit, a clinical unit being about 70 or 80 beds. We worked during the day, obviously, but the problem was that the 2 of us, between us, had to do on duty and cover those 70 or 80 beds at all times. So we were on duty alternate nights and alternate weekends. The weekend began at 9 o'clock on Friday morning and ended at 6 o'clock on Monday night.
Gosh.
So it was 80 hours constantly on duty at a time, of course, when there weren't intensive care beds.
Yeah.
So the critically ill, the very sick, were actually on the wards. Obviously, we weren't working all the time, but by the time Monday evening came, you were exhausted, frankly. You were a zombie, very much afraid that you would make a clinical mistake. And furthermore, afraid that if you did make a mistake, the circumstances under which you were working would not be recognised. But clearly there were other aspects of it which were very enjoyable. When one looks back, one thinks of the camaraderie that developed in the doctor's mess. Life in the doctor's mess was really very, very pleasant. It was very much like being an officer, if you like, in an officer's mess of the services. We had our own bedrooms, rather bleakly furnished, I have to say. The bathrooms were at a distance, but my prostate was rather better in those days than it is now. The plumbing in the bathrooms was Victorian. The bathrooms were unheated. There was a very large cast iron bath in the middle of it, and when you pulled the plug out, the water ran into a gully across a tiled floor and out of the side. It was Victorian. The dining facilities were interested. When I qualified in the 1960s, and when I joined Manchester Royal Infirmary, for the doctors, there were 2 dining rooms. There was a male dining room and a female dining room. And within a week, we had changed that to have a more sensible arrangement. There was a television lounge, black and white. There was a billiard room. But it was in the lounge that the social atmosphere developed. At one end of the lounge, there was a bar which served beer 24/7.
There are some things we'd like to bring back, I think, yeah.
The beer was supplied by a local brewery at discount price. It was serve yourself and sign the honesty book. Didn't
Which
have
you
the
always did, of
alcohol
course.
policy that you have in the hospitals these days. But there was an attitude, there was an atmosphere in the hospital that doesn't seem to exist anymore. And there were things that happened, funny events that happened, which I suspect would not be politically acceptable these days.
Of course. And we perhaps won't dwell on those, but thank you so much. Olive. Now, Olive, your story I love, because you qualified as a nurse in 1945. So you were practicing as a nurse for 3 years before the NHS was even founded.
I took my finals the year of that we became NHS.
Wow.
And one of the things I remember, I was working at that time in the outpatients casualty, and the patients would come in and, you'd dress them with a crepe bandage. You would make sure that they came back to the next day with the crepe bandage, and you, the nurse, would wash the bandage and use it, if they were lucky, on the same patient.
Yeah.
Now, it sounds horrific, doesn't it? You think of the kind of bugs, germs, how could we do that? When the NHS came in, we could have as many crepe bandages as we liked. Also, one of the main things that I remember particularly was rubber gloves in the theatre. We had to use a bicycle pump repair kit we'd blow them up on night duty because we weren't allowed to sit and do nothing. We'd make dressings and we'd blew these gloves up and used to stick the little stickers on. And, you can't imagine now doing this kind of thing.
You really can't. That's amazing.
And
the chief nursing officer sitting over there, I think she's wondering, what it involves.
Of course, the prescriptions and all the things were free.
Yeah.
But when you think of glasses, spectacles, dentures, all drugs free. Until I looked it up the other day, I wanted to be correct with the date. They were free until 1954, nearly bankrupted the NHS because, everybody had, I'm saying everybody, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but an awful lot of people had spectacles that wouldn't have had spectacles before. And, all the drugs, even aspirins, they would have them via the NHS, would cost a lot of money. They could have got them for a shilling from the pharmacy. But if they went to the doctor would prescribe it, and an awful lot of them felt pressurised at that time.
Okay. So finances have always been the Secretary of State was obviously just talking about where we find ourselves now, but always an issue.
One of the things, am I okay for time?
You are, of course you are.
I don't want to ramble on, but one of the things that I remember was in 1946 we had a pay rise. Prior to that, we had 10 shillings per week in our hand. Okay. We had a bed and breakfast and our meals. And again, we had male, we didn't have many male nurses in those days, but we weren't allowed in with the male doctor, with the male doctors. And of course, we, you know, as nurses, we were quite frivolous, and
Surely
you know,
not.
we were not allowed officially into the doctor's area, but we used to go, you know. And, you know,
I thought the punchline was coming when you said officially. I had to take that. But
Yeah.
Cynthia, you trained as a doctor in the 60s, and I think less than 20% of entrance into medical school at that time were women. And of course,
in our medical
in
school,
your medical school,
there were 4 women to 21 men. Yes,
Yeah.
and it was very much like has been described with Peter, the circumstances, your living arrangements. We didn't have a separate dining room, but we had the rather sparse individual rooms, and we were on call sort of round the clock. There wasn't the turnover of patients that there is today, one can say that. Many patients would come in and be there for 2 or 3 weeks. There was always something going wrong with them, and it was your responsibility to see to that. But it was a very full-time commitment, particularly when you were on call over many nights and days. We didn't have the bar at the end of the dining room, but we did have a kitchen that at night time we could cook omelettes and bacon because you needed to have something to keep you going. And there was the camaraderie. That's what I remember particularly. It was good fun, even though you were exhausted half the time.
And what changes did you see over the course of your career?
My career?
What was the biggest change you saw?
Well, the biggest changes were in the treatments that were available to people with time. I mean, hip replacement came in, and then subsequent joint replacements. Every field, cataracts changed from being a 2-week stay in hospital to 20 minutes in outpatients. Coroners would come in and stay for 6 weeks when I was a houseman, but that's, you know, they're lucky if they get 6 hours now. Everything has been speeded up, but a lot more could be done. I remember seeing some of the original, the first open heart surgery and things like that that were unimaginable before. So there has been such a tremendous change.
And I'm seeing lots of nods as I look around in terms of the camaraderie that you talk of and that kind of spirit of the team. And clearly lots of things have changed for the better in terms of what we can do for our patients, but you feel some things have also been lost along the way as well.
Well, I think probably it has, but I'm not in a position to know now. I'm sure there is camaraderie, but we were in contact with each other sort of 24 hours a day often, and so it wasn't like being there for 8 hours, 10 hours and then going home. There was no home to go to. That was your home.
The hospital was the,
Yes.
Thank you all so much for your time and for your patience as we overran slightly. It's really kind of you to come and help us celebrate the contribution. And on behalf of everyone in the hall, and they'll show their appreciation as well, thank you for your contribution over the years. There's something, Olive, please, of course.
I forgot before because, you know, I'm 90 and your memory
You're looking
goes
well on it,
somewhat.
madam. You're looking very well on it. Please, go ahead.
One of the things that was very, very important for Peter and this lady here, the patients no longer had to pay
Yeah.
when they came in to the ward. You know, we can't imagine now going to hospital and the little nurse kind of admitting you and saying, did you pay insurance? If the lady or the wife didn't work, no way did she pay insurance. And you would then say, did you pay a hospital Saturday fund?
Yeah.
No. And you would then say, I'll have to ask the Lady Almoner to come and visit you. And this, of course, was assessment.
Which is the charitable...
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, it was very hard, really hard to kind of imagine, you know, regarding the crepe bandage, to say to someone, can you boil these?
Yeah.
And they say, we haven't any gas. You know, it's not envisaged now. I just wanted to...
No, and thank you. It's a fantastic note to finish on, because it reminds all of us how truly fortunate we are that wartime generation saw the formation of the NHS, the formation of the welfare state, as a really important outcome of what they went through in the war. And I think it's also, in terms of all of you, as we try and commit to what we need to do to the future, there's something about standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of as we move forward. So thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, as Niall said, there's tea and cake. So please do join us for that. And again, if I can leave you with that little reminder about the NHS Retirement Fellowship and just checking what it is you do in your organisation in relation to the fabulous work that John and his colleagues do, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much for your time in the last couple of days in Manchester.
The first operation I had on the National Health, I had my appendix out when I was 15.
I found out I needed an operation, and every time I get really bad pains, and St James's has been there for me.
I was there at the concert when the bomb went off. I had access to free therapy sessions, and that was through my doctor as well, and I don't think I would be as stable as I am now without that.
The NHS for me is a sense of great pride, because my family come from a country where you can't access healthcare free at the point of need, so you have to pay for everything from visiting your GP, visiting the hospital, to paying for your medication, and it gives me great pride to be part of an organisation that provides this free at the point of need.
As an American from the States, and I say this all the time, the NHS is really, it's a privilege, and it's a hero, really, and I don't know where I'd be without it.
I'm dual nationality, and actually the NHS is one of the things that makes me really proud to be British.
The NHS means to me everything, I guess, because my mum and dad came to this country because of the NHS.
As a communications person working within the NHS, it makes me feel proud to be part of the function that can shout about all the amazing things that it does.
Marie Curie was always on my doorstep where I grew up, and I like the idea of volunteering there.
I was originally, when I left school, apprentice engineer.
That was where I got my first job when I came out of uni.
I wanted to join either the police or the ambulance service. I wanted a job that was more rewarding.
That was where I sort of developed the love for what I do and decided that I wanted to work in the NHS.
When I was 21, because you had to be 21 to join the service then, I decided to join the ambulance service.
I'm so proud of the NHS. The NHS is literally the best thing that I think Britain has to offer.
My parents, especially my father, was really proud when I joined the ambulance service.
NHS means everything to me. For me, my family, especially my two younger girls, they both got sickle cell. So regular trips to the hospital and getting to know the specialist nurses and doctors, NHS means everything.
I have a 12-year-old son. He came 3 months early, and if it wasn't for the NHS and even with the blood transfusion, he wouldn't be here today.
It means so much. If we didn't have it there, I don't know what I would do and what most people would do. I think we're a very blessed country to have the NHS.
We can do this together for you.
What the NHS means to me is an awful lot. I've worked in the NHS for 35 years, and it's an institution. It's a place where people can be safely looked after, irrespective of their need to pay, whatever their shape, colour, creed or social situation. The NHS has that ability to look after anyone in that situation, so it means an awful lot to me.